Time is limited. Nice to meet you all. My name is Baldvin Bergsson. I'm the Deputy Director of News at RUV, which is the Icelandic National Broadcasting Service. It's great to be in this room today. I actually worked in this house 25 years ago. Can you believe it? Back then I was young and optimistic. Now I'm a cynical journalist. But I'm hoping the talks here today can sort of bring me back to my past. I actually, in 1999, I was also studying political science at the University of Iceland, and I sometimes came to this very room to do my studies. And I remember that almost exactly 25 years ago, I was on the stage in a couch that was being used for a play, reading a book that had just been published called We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families. And I'm sure many of you know that book. It's about the genocide in Rwanda. And back then I was thinking, wow, just imagine people actually being there on the ground, doing the peace talks, trying to actually create a dialogue between the two parties. And 25 years later, I'm sitting on this stage with people that were actually there and with people that have on-the-ground experience from various conflict areas around the world. So, very welcome. I'm going to introduce you one by one and give you a chance to say a couple of words. And I'm going to start with you, Miriam. Miriam Coronel Ferrer, she's a founding member of the Southeast Asian Women Peace Mediators. She was a member of the UN standby team of mediators for 3 years. Her project included mediation support for UN missions in Afghanistan, the Maldives, Iraq, and Georgia. She had the government panel that negotiated and signed the 2014 comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and thus becoming the first woman in the world to sign as chief negotiator a major peace agreement with a non-state armed group. She's a retired professor of politics from the University of the Philippines. Currently, she sits as a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group and Geneva-based Interpeace. Mm-hmm. So, a couple of words from you to begin with.
Yes, good morning to everyone. I thought we were going to follow the sequence in the photograph, but certainly, first of all, I'd like to say that the lighting of the Imagine Peace Tower is very sentimental to me because when we signed the peace agreement in 2014, of course, you had to use a pen. And the pen was a very expensive pen, but it came back to me in a box together with the single vinyl record of John Lennon, Imagine, and which had this signature, and that was like our gift for finally signing the peace agreement. So, but yeah, you talked about being a cynical journalist, and I know that in meetings also with very young people in South Africa last month and just yesterday in the class of Celia, I found that there is really this kind of disappointment, even dismay about the way things are going. But what I'd like to say is that there's a lot of peace building going on the ground, a lot of dialogues taking place, where it matters to people, in good or perhaps better times, and even in the worst of times. Dialogue persists even where war rages, and I'm just going to give a few examples in the case of Israel and Palestine, where of course there are high-level dialogues taking place among the Arab states, with or without the US, in the UN General Assembly, and even in the constricted frame of the UN Security Council. But while this has not brought us any closer to a ceasefire yet, and in fact we are seeing a broadening of the conflict, there are actually people-to-people level dialogues that are happening. Two of the recipients of the 2024 Hillary Clinton Award just last week were Women of the Sun, which is a Palestinian group working publicly with Israelis, and the Israeli organization called Women Waging Peace, the group that worked to advance what they called a mother's call to stop the vicious cycle of bloodshed. 3 members of the Women Waging Peace were killed on October 7, and several members of Women of the Sun were killed afterwards, after October 7. and yet they have continued this dialogue despite the terrible tragedies that they have faced. I am also working with a group of women in Israel, both Palestinian and Israelis that call themselves Itamaki, or Women Lawyers for Social Justice, and they're giving voice precisely to women subject to all kinds of discrimination, social, ethnic, national, class discrimination, and have also organized several workshops and training programs among themselves to be able to reinforce their role in society as mediators, trying to find a solution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. There are also interfaith groups across the two communities. There's the group called Israeli Interfaith Encounter Association, and another group that's working between members of the bureaucracies of both the Israeli and Palestinian authorities. So what I'm saying here is that even as the war rages, there are actually all these peace-building initiatives that are happening that are, in the end, the very foundation for that kind of sustainable peace that we need. And while I can talk about Myanmar and the different levels of dialogue that has been happening later on, let me just share a few words from the women whom we met as part of our research project on post-agreement dialogue processes. As you know, we are still undergoing the transition phase of implementing our peace agreement. And we asked these women, what does dialogue mean to you? How should dialogue be done? What issues, with whom and among whom? And of course, the usual issues will surface: human rights violations, clan wars, the feuding wars, which are really part of the traditional societies, which are very clannish in that sense, and also some of the ceasefire issues that continue to emerge every now and then. And of course, not to mention all of these village policies. So what does dialogue mean to them? For them, a dialogue is a tool for continuing the peace process. And when is an event a dialogue and when it is not, according to them? When people can speak up on their vulnerabilities and needs, and then they feel empowered about it, that's a dialogue. But it is not just meaningless talking. It also includes negotiation to secure some commitments, which they may or may not get in any specific dialogue event. For example, they were saying there should be more women in the ceasefire mechanisms, but they were told, no, it's very hard to bring in more women because then we need all of these logistic things. So that was not a very successful dialogue that they had at them. So for a dialogue to succeed, for them it was very important to have a safe space, that it be held in neutral ground, and a facilitator that can speak and correct the power imbalance, because they do feel that obviously there are power imbalances in any social context. The manner is important, whether you are offensive or positive, and people in a position, particularly their conscious, do not like to be challenged. Finally, why dialogue? And here I found really very interesting answers for them. And I found that there's a lot of reflexivity among the women. And for them, why dialogue? One is to transform our understanding of the problem, so we may know where we could be wrong and understand each other's interest. And then finally, not only to solve the problem, but also to ensure sustainability of the relationships. As we know, if you're in a community, relationships are very, very important. Community mediators, a good number are really rising up to the task and very brave and spending their own money to be able to settle precisely these conflicts. So where is peace being built? It's being built in the interstices of war-torn fragments, in the grids and patterns or even edges of a conflict tapestry, in arenas and streets, in homes and villages, palaces and offices. If you think of it, it's the same places where the people are being robbed or deprived of their peace. In other words, peace is being built where there isn't any in its fullness or where it is threatened. Peace is being built through the countervailing efforts of those who think and choose peace, initiate, facilitate, participate in dialogues, and other forms of active non-violence. So to imagine peace, one may say, is to be witness to these multiple layers of dialogues that are taking place, taking shape in safe spaces where people are able to articulate their grievances and differences, are conversing with each other, and come up with mutually beneficial commitments to find a common path, just and fair solutions, and to quote one young woman, to be comfortable in our communities without fear, freedom to engage in livelihood, not displaced, not a victim of harassment. And that's probably just my starting point for today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A lot of great points there that I'm sure we will touch upon later. Next, Dag Nylander. He has been the director of NOREF, Norwegian Centre for Conflict Resolution, since 2020. And prior to joining NOREF, he was director and head of the section for peace and reconciliation in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has held several diplomatic positions, most notably as a mediator and Norwegian special envoy to Colombia. From 2010 to 2016, he led the Norwegian facilitation of the peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC. In 2017, he was appointed the United Nations Secretary General's personal representative on the border controversy between Venezuela and Guyana. Dag.
Thank you so much, Baldvin, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious event, and thank you to my colleagues in this panel. While I was flying into Reykjavik yesterday, I was reminded of a previous job I did in New York at the United Nations in the early 2000s. I was working as a young diplomat at the Norwegian mission to the United Nations, and Norway was at the Security Council at that moment. And this was a new and extremely interesting world for a young diplomat to be in, obviously. And it was frightening in a way, because it was big politics. It was the Security Council, it was the permanent members of the Security Council, etc. Very important discussions. But looking back at it, it also felt very safe. It was sort of a safe space. This was the early 2000s. The Cold War had ended. We were moving towards the end of the special period following the Cold War, and the belief in that the world was indeed moving in a straight line. That we were talking about the end of history. The Security Council was the space to have dialogue about war and peace. Dialogue today is almost a dirty word. You have to be careful when you speak about dialogue. You have to measure your audience, who is listening. So we need to be smarter, all of us who work for dialogue, with dialogue, in peace processes, trying to convince parties to sit down and talk peace. We need to be smarter, we need to be better in terms of how we talk about this issue, the importance of convincing warring parties, political opponents, to sit down and talk. We really need to measure our words. We can't be blue-eyed about these issues. We heard earlier today, I agree, very powerful intervention. And there is a time to, what's the saying? There's a time to fight and there is a time to talk. And we do not want peace at any price. We want peace, yes, but it has to be done in the right way. And I think, the past couple of years with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has really shown us in Norway. Norway is a country, a state. It has successive governments that has really been putting lots of efforts and resources into being a third-party actors, helping warring parties, political opponents to sit down and have a dialogue. But we have really been reminded, we knew this already, we have been saying this for years, parties in the front seat. You can't come from the outside telling the parties when to talk and what to talk about. But Ukraine and the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine has really taught us this, reminded us this very forcefully, that it has to be, in this case, not us who tells Ukraine when to talk and what to talk about, obviously, but they have to be in the driver's seat and set the terms for that dialogue and that those peace negotiations themselves. We often say that a conflict needs to be ripe for negotiation. It needs to be ripe for settlement, which is a relatively clinical way of describing it, but it is true, and I think it is always a good starting point when you are confronted with a conflict. Is this the moment to talk? Is this the moment to dialogue? And you need to dissect the ripeness of the situation to be able to answer that question. So a lot of respect for that. I would like to underline that particular point here today. But having said that, you always need to plan for dialogue. You need to plan for peace. You need to really be prepared for that day when the situation is ripe. You need to be ready to negotiate. So you need to have done all those preparations. And I can only imagine how difficult it is being in the midst of a conflict, be that in Colombia, where I have worked, or in Venezuela or other places, to really think about how do I negotiate peace with my opponent when I am in the midst of a war, defending myself. That takes lots of resources, and that is where I think good friends, third parties can be of help, with coming in, low profile, not demanding much, but offering resources to be prepared for dialogue and negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Moving on, Chris Coulter has over 20 years of experience with the fields of peace, security, and mediation. She's the Deputy Executive Director at the Berlin-based Berghof Foundation. And in addition to her key role there, she heads the department in charge of mediation support, negotiation, and training. Previously, she served as Chief Operations Officer and Director of Programs at the Negotiation Strategies Institute in Jerusalem, and the head of the Dialogue and Peace Mediation Unit at the Folke Bernadotte Academy, the Swedish government agency for peace, security, and development. She has worked as an international gender, peace, and security expert for almost 20 years, with assignments in more than a dozen countries.
Thank you so much. That makes me sound really old. Well, first, let me begin to thank the organizers for inviting me and my distinguished colleagues and the previous speakers, and to see all of you lovely people in the room. And I'm happy to be in a forum where we're actually talking about peace and dialogue, because those are too far and few between. In the past year, I've been, well, I won't say assaulted, but I've heard two messages consistently, two very different messages, over again and again and again. One is from Western donors that are constantly telling us that we need to be prepared for budget cuts. There will be budget cuts for peace building. There will be no more money for peace building. I'll get back to that. The other message is from, I would say, non-Western countries, and that's the issue of norms, what's called Western norms, the critique of the liberal agenda. So I'm hearing these two messages constantly throughout the year. So I thought I would sort of frame my intervention in a bit of those terms. I just came back this week from a meeting in South Africa. It was the first annual meeting on African peace and security dialogue, also the word dialogue in that word. It's supposed to be an annual event chaired by the former president, Thabo Mbeki. In that room, the criticism of Western norms and the liberal agenda abounded, and the need to find innovative ideas, new solutions. I'm not entirely sure what the alternative to those norms would be yet, but it does make one, as a white Nordic, critically self-reflect. Okay, if it doesn't work, what then could work, and what's wrong with them? And is it the rule-based order, or is it human rights, or exactly what is the criticism of those norms? I do agree, as a global community, we have failed again and again in peacefully settling violent conflicts. We are hypocritical, and we are more often accused of being hypocritical. We can see that in the just past few years. I met a Chinese diplomat who we asked him, "What do you think of us, the Europeans?" And he hesitated for a bit, and before he said, "We think you're hypocrites. We think you're moralizing." And he said the Europeans were worse than the Americans in that sense. So, I mean, that does make you think, because that actor is also taking place on the mediation stage in a new way that we are not used to. Many of the conflicts we see today, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Israel, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, are increasingly complex, lots of proxies, lots of mediators, lots of processes, and that doesn't make it easier. When it comes to Sudan, which is one of those conflicts that we don't read so much about, it's coming a bit increasingly in the media. I did check, New York Times just did a search. There hasn't been an article on Sudan since mid-September, I think. There was a report last week on, not about the conflict, but about the food situation in Sudan, which of course is related to the conflict. So if the war doesn't end in January 2025, there might be 12 million deaths. That's more than the population of Sweden, where I'm from. And that's just a fact, because the planting season and access to food security, and you know, I'm pretty sure both conflict parties in that conflict would agree to that. But then what the solution is. Sudan is also very complex because there's so many processes and so many parties. So you have the UN envoy and the UN-led process. You have the US-led process. And you have the Cairo process led by the Egyptians. And then you have the Alps group and the Saudis and the Emiratis. And so there's as many processes as there are mediators, not to mention all of the private diplomacy efforts, of which, you know, we are several organizations here also working on Sudan. And do we coordinate? Svetlana, you mentioned increased military spending. And you also mentioned sort of the end of the Cold War and the liberal world order. And to be honest, I realized I was raised in that world order and believed in those values, and those are the values that I was raised by. And for that reason, those words like equality, solidarity, and human rights, they were formative for me and my generation. And yet we need then to be constantly willing to listen, to understand, to evolve, and which then brings me back to norms. And what's the critique of those norms? to have them have a nuanced critique and to nuancedly reflect over what it means. To be more specific, when I did inquire a bit more, it has to do also with how we conceive of peace mediation. And it's constantly referred to our templates, the templates we use, and you would be familiar with that also, Dag. Cessation of hostilities, ceasefire, and then we move on to talks about political power sharing, wealth sharing, and then social, TJ, truth and reconciliation. We have, like, in a way, a sort of a linear idea of how peace should be processed, which we might need to reconsider. I think also the idea that one excludes the other, that increased military spending by necessity means decreased funding for peace building, might be actually wrong. I think we also heard the State Secretary say that we have never seen more conflicts. We've never seen more conflict-related deaths since World War II, displacement and refugees. And the results of climate-induced conflict, we know that preventive dialogue is essential. The rise of authoritarianism, I don't need to mention all of them, it mentioned before. I don't know about you, but you know, that sounds scary to me. And the change in the geopolitical landscape, but it's hard to believe that military victories will lead to sustained peace. Military victories can end wars, but they can't build peace. So the need to consistently fund our world is still important. On the cutting of our budgets, so our donors are saying this to us constantly, that we have to be prepared for cut budgets. On the other hand, some of them, I won't mention any names, of those donor countries are also cautioning us against engaging too much with the other potential mediators who do not share our values. The interesting thing is that if we, as Westerners, leave that domain, it's open for anyone to enter, whether it's China or Turkey or the Gulf states, and there is a necessity to also engage with them. But despite how bleak everything sounds, I do still feel hope. In the past 3 weeks, I've spent a whole week with women Ukrainian diplomats in a training course that we do, that's funded by the Finnish, and just to see the resilience of those women. And also after that, I spent a week with women insider mediators in peaceful protest movements from all over the world, Venezuela, Lebanon, South Thailand, and that's another force as well that we still consistently need to support, and in a way that you mentioned, Miriam, the sort of dialogue. Dag also mentioned ripeness, and the ambassador talked about incentives. So what are the incentives for conflict parties to enter that dialogue, and how can we, ripeness doesn't come by itself, we can also nudge ripeness, whether it's through power politics or the more facilitative mediation. I'm a very pragmatic person, and even when facing the plight of civilization, the plight of war and carnage, I do, as the ambassador, believe that we need to talk to everyone, even if we don't like them, and engagement is not endorsement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, Nita, Yawanarajah. I hope I'm pronouncing this.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. She's our last speaker on this panel. She has had a long career in international peace and security. She started out in the Malaysian Navy and the Malaysian Permanent Mission at the UN, and went on to join the UN and served in various conflict situations from Rwanda to Bosnia, Kosovo, to Darfur. She was a pioneer on mediation issues at the UN, helping to establish the UN mediation support units, later joined the Commonwealth Secretariat as the head of its conflict prevention and preventive diplomacy unit. Today she works at Oxford Process, a quiet diplomacy organization which works behind the scenes to ripen conditions for peacemaking. And recently she joined the rare club of practitioner academics, completed a doctorate in war studies at King's College in London. Her thesis, Mediating Durable Ceasefires and Peace Agreements in Violent Conflicts, couldn't be more timely. So, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Baldvin, and good morning to everybody. I first want to thank our organizers, Pia Hansen and her team at the Reykjavik Peace Centre, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and having the honor to be here with you at this forum. It's an inspiration to be in Reykjavik, as we heard yesterday from the mayor, a city of peace in a country without a military. How rare is that? Listening to the speech last night and attending the event of the lighting of the tower inspires me a little bit with my remarks here today. There's really very little that can be said when you are sharing a panel with esteemed colleagues like these. Everything has already been covered. So what I am going to do is actually try to shed my cynicism and take a page off last night's inspirational lighting of the tower and try to frame my remarks in a way that we can think a little bit outside the box. We are today at a crossroads, I believe. We can either continue our current trajectory where war and violence become the norm, where negotiations and peaceful settlement of disputes are rejected, where human life, the killing of innocent children and civilians mean nothing, and we are numb to the images that we see on television, where cities are destroyed and communities and nations are annihilated. This could be the norm, our new norm. Or we could have a reset. We can take a breath, we can take a minute and say enough is enough and come back to our senses, our shared humanity. Could we imagine such a reset? What would that look like? So let's imagine a world where history matters, where we acknowledge and empathize with the historical journey that each of us, each peoples, nations, and countries have taken to arrive where we are. And instead of rejecting the historical context, grievances, and precedents as whataboutism, which happens today a lot. Can we imagine a world where diplomacy means something again, where it means talking to your enemies, those we don't like, not just your friends, where diplomats try hard and are encouraged to find common ground, even with those with whom we may never want to have a cup of coffee or want to be friends with or align ourselves with, instead of walking out of meetings and canceling them. Can we imagine a world where we did not use force and punitive measures to break the will of a people or a nation so that they will bend to our will, or use incentives and rewards to bribe or corrupt parties into acquiescence, and instead use problem solving and collaborative creative thinking to find new and perhaps better solutions, something we might not have imagined at the very beginning? Can we imagine a world where we did not judge others for their political and economic development models and paths because we believe our values and governance models are super or better, and divide the world into good and evil camps, rational, irrational camps, or Democrats and authoritarians? Or judge others for their terrible acts and behavior because we know that we are capable of such doings ourselves, and in fact have done so in many parts of the world? What would that world that we imagine look like? Actually, surprisingly, it is not a new world. It would actually be a reset for diplomacy, mediation, and peacemaking to its basic principles of recognizing that we cannot make durable peace without understanding historical context of the conflict, that making peace requires talking to our enemies, and especially talking to our enemies. That making peace requires impartiality so that we cannot at the same time be judge and jury. That making durable peace is not only about using brute force and wealth to dominate or humiliate, but a delicate endeavor that is about balancing power. Balancing power where we empower the weak, not only with weapons, but also with skills, ideas, problem solving. We weaken our enemies, not just with limiting their access to resources, but where in extreme asymmetries, we also align ourselves unbelievingly with the strong so that we might convince them to make the necessary concessions and to gift the peace for a weaker people. Building peace is in an extremely hostile world requires all of us as a collective, mediators, practitioners, academics, and policymakers, to insist upon these very principles that we've kind of veered off from in recent times. And we, instead of allowing their continued erosion today for the popular trend, and to call out these principles and stand firm to them without the fear of being cancelled altogether. I'm going to end my remarks there.
Thank you so much. I knew I would probably need 70 minutes with each and every one of you, but I think we have 20 minutes left plus questions from the audience, so I'm going to dive into it. Now, the title of the session is Building Peace in an Increasingly Hostile World, Keeping the Dialogue Going, and sort of moving on from, I think, what each and every one of you touched upon. Where did we fail? I mean, how did we sort of lose the ability to keep the dialogue going? Why did we allow the world to reach this stage?
Okay, maybe I'll start. First is in understanding the conflict. I think that's very basic. You do conflict analysis, and if you have these biases and prejudices, how you frame the conflict, then you're sort of losing your way. And I can talk about the example of Myanmar, which maybe you are not aware of, but the conflict in Myanmar with the coup d'etat that happened in 2021 preceded Ukraine and also Gaza and now Lebanon. And it's a civil war that's taking place there. And for the longest time, people were thinking that the solution to this is a dialogue between the military junta and all these diverse groups that are fighting the state, because it broke down the coup d'etat broke the democratic process, scuttled the whole peace process that was going on. And now you see all of these ethnic groups, ethnic armed groups, and even ordinary students coming up in arms, putting up their People's Defense Forces to fight the junta. And for them, the bottom line is no more power sharing with the military. And it took a long time, for example, the ASEAN, which the international community has relegated to be the primary mover for this conflict because they're so busy with all these other conflicts. And we know that ASEAN is not exactly as proactive as, say, even the African Union with all its mediation mechanisms. ASEAN is still very much entrenched in its tradition of non-interference in domestic affairs and the primacy of sovereignty of states. But they did have a framework for that, and that framework included inclusive dialogue. But it's only recently that they're realizing that the inclusive dialogue that must be done is this dialogue with all of these resistance forces, ethnic armed groups, the government in exile, the National Unity Government, and also the civil society that is also fighting. They're not bearing arms, but they're precisely all up against another arrangement where the military will continue to be a powerful player. And what's happening actually now is precisely all of these kinds of dialogues taking place between civil society organizations and ethnic armed groups, between the political group of the National Unity Government and the ethnic armed groups. And also different levels of dialogue, like India just organized a dialogue with the other side of Myanmar, with the Rakhines, the Rohingyas, and also the Chin that are closer to India. The whole idea being that the solution to this problem is not so much another compromise with the military junta and the people who have been deprived precisely of what real federalism could be, but for that federalism to be built from the ground through the people that are actually thinking about what kinds of constitution that they will have at the state level, what police reforms will be needed at their level, and then eventually coming together to build a bottoms-up type of federation for a real federation, democratic federation for the people of Myanmar. Of course, there's also the threat of fragmentation resulting from this process, but it's up to them. It's up to the people, and certainly not up to the military junta.
Thank you. Doug.
Thank you. Yeah, I know I asked for the floor to try to respond to your question. I'm not going to be able to, but I think it's if we try to answer the question, how did we fail or where did we fail? I assume that we're talking about the current international situation, marked particularly by war in Europe, wars in the Middle East. I think, and trying to answer that by going back to the issue of the importance of dialogue, when the international balance is shifting, when changes are underway and it is perceived by everyone, be that the end of the Cold War or be that the increased competition between the US and China, big power competition, etc. When the world is changing, I think dialogue is particularly important, because when the world is changing, states and actors are more uncertain of what their position is, how other states and actors are going to respond if they move, etc. And going back to the case of Ukraine, not being an expert and not having studied this particular issue, some people have stated that for whatever motivation Vladimir Putin had in 2014, a couple of years ago, when he started the full-scale war, whatever motivation, he cannot have been aware of how the Ukrainians and how the international community was going to react. I think that was a clear miscalculation of his part. And we have heard from many sources that the US signaling to Vladimir Putin shortly before the war broke out could have been much clearer, should have been much clearer. So I think dialogue, particularly when the balance is shifting internationally, is crucial. And similarly we can look at the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, the war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon. The international community was complacent over too many years, with an apparent status quo. We all knew that the situation was untenable. Did we do enough to help? Probably not. If we look at Asia, the situation over Taiwan, I think dialogue is key to avoid misunderstandings, and is key to avoid that one party steps over what is a red line. So there are no misunderstandings in terms of how the international community is going to respond. and what the situation is going to entail should there be, abrupt movements in shifting that particular balance. So I think, my very inadequate and overly general response to your question is, when the balance is shifting, dialogue is more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more with my colleagues. Doug is absolutely right about the transformation. I think there is a geopolitical transformation going on right now, but from a unipolar world, which has emerged after the Cold War, to what will probably become a multipolar world. It's not easy, I think, for the unipolar power from being the first amongst equals, or primus inter pares, to move towards a situation where you're only one amongst equals. That is going to require a complete mindset change. And shifting that position is absolutely going to require dialogue, more respect for the other way of thinking, other viewpoints, etc. But I would also like to blame COVID for where we are today, because we have, during COVID for 2 years, lived in our own little bubbles of talking to only like-minded people, engaging within our small groups perhaps. And so we haven't had that organic challenges of debate, hearing other views for quite some time. It's a good couple of years. And so we're coming out of that isolationism and suddenly confronting a world which is going through this transition. And I think, here we ourselves haven't adjusted to being able to hear the different views and adjusting to being open again and being creative again.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, just a few comments. I also agree with the previous speakers, but you asked us where we failed. I think, with these geopolitical shifts, there were early warning signs that we just chose not to see. There can be, and I think for Putin and for other autocratic leaders, I think we've realized now that they actually mean what they say. We were like, no, they won't do that, no. But they do mean what they say, and there are early warning signs. And I think dialogue is one of the sort of first victims to fall, but it's even more important. But just a comment.
Thank you. You work in quiet diplomacy. Can you just, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with it. Can you just explain what it is and does it work?
Sure. Well, quiet diplomacy is, first off, I cannot actually speak about what it is that we do in specific terms, because by nature it's quiet. We can't shout out our successes. We can't go in the newspapers and talk about where we're traveling to or which place who we're talking to, which are all the hallmarks of traditional diplomacy and UN mediation or EU mediation, etc. Where especially today, everything is out in the media and there's no room for quietness, but also no room for a private discussion that remains private, etc. So for quiet diplomacy, what we do is we engage by building relationships with people who are close to the centers of power, who have the ability to shape and influence thinking. We build those relationships because we might have gone to school with somebody, we might have worked with somebody, etc. We pick up the phone, we reignite that relationship. Then we also create the credibility, whether it's with your experience, your expertise. It's something that I like to call fermenting. We plant possible ideas of how a conflict might be resolved, something that might take a long time to become fermented, because that idea needs time to travel through society, to travel upwards and downwards in hierarchy, to gain traction within the society. So all of that is done quietly. It's like having somebody in your ear when you're having those microphones telling you what to say, but it allows you a pause to think and say, might like that, but not right now. But then you come back to it maybe in a couple of months, etc. So that's a little bit in a gist what quiet diplomacy is about.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to see if someone from the audience wants to ask a question. Yes, as I imagined, several questions already.
Hello, my name is Rósa Björk Brynjarsdóttir and I'm a former member of the Parliament of Iceland, and thank you very much for your intervention. I would just like to ask you one big question, but maybe short answers, which is maybe not possible. But I would like to hear your views on the outlook of the situation in the Middle East right now. And if you can elaborate a little bit on your outlook on the situation, which is really fragile and volatile for the moment. Thank you.
Yes, just a short answer to a simple question.
Can I say so? Oh, I think we need to go back to the question of norms, which we have been discussing. Chris mentioned about it. It's really not so much a question of like third world countries or the South questioning the norms. In fact, if they're violating the norms, they sort of become defensive. And let's remember, social economic human rights in the UN was the driving force behind that, were the post-colonial states. The problem is when they contrapose civil rights with economic rights, and we know they do that for a lot of political reasons of self-interest that supports their own regime. But going back to the question of norms, it's not the question of norms, but it's the application or selectivity of norms that's really driving this, that's sort of like creating this, this confusion or this disappointment or anger about how the world is today, when the West firmly aligned with Ukraine against Russia. But now you see some Western countries firmly aligned with an occupying force and not being able to exert their leverage or not even to speak in the same tone as these universal norms that they're applying in the case of Ukraine with regard to the situation in Gaza. And that's, I think, the problem, the global problem that we're seeing now, because it's eroding precisely the same norms that we have built over the decades. It's eroding the multilateral system when these systems are not able to respond proactively, when you can't get a UN Security Council resolution to stop the war in Israel and Gaza and stop it from spreading. I think that's the big problem now. So who can now really exert that leverage? If these countries, the powerful countries, are not precisely exerting that leverage on the question of the conflict in Israel and Gaza.
Does anyone else want to comment, or should we get another question?
No, just to add, I'm completely in agreement. It's very difficult to answer your question, obviously, but I think the issue of norms is key. You know, what we see in the Middle East and what we see in Ukraine is, you know, the breaking down of norms. You know, there's a very fine line between, you know, civilization and barbarity. You know, what, you know, keeps us together is really the norms that we have developed over centuries and millennia. And when states break those norms, break those rules, then they and individuals need to be held accountable. So I hope the war in the Middle East and in Ukraine and elsewhere ends in states and people being held accountable. That often makes the road the parties need to travel to a peace agreement harder and longer, but for the sustainability of peace and for the development of humankind, I think it is necessary that states and people are held responsible. So I think I hope that is one of the outcomes and one of the answers to the question that you asked.
I agree with both the previous speakers, but I would say that erosion of norms, that historical context didn't start with Ukraine. You could say it started with the invasion of Iraq. And if you recall, during the early days of the Ukraine war, a lot of videos on what was Twitter at that time was going back to the Iraq war as to what did the world do when Iraq took place, etc. It was also an invasion under false justifications. I mean, not that anybody liked Saddam Hussein, but nonetheless. So there was that narrative, and here was that superpower doing that was okay, and this superpower doing this is not okay, and now today it's the same in the Middle East, etc. So to go back to what Miriam said, the selectivity of those with power to act without impunity and say that they are spreading norms, etc., and then to hold those others to account is one of the biggest problems we have, and why the world is becoming more and more divided into this global, the North or the collective West versus the rest debate, so to speak, I think.
Thank you.
And just briefly, I think, of course, this conflict is very close to me, so it's also hard to talk about. But I agree also with the speakers. But I mean, what we're seeing now, this tit-for-tat arms race, is just unfeasible in the long term. But I think if you ask a lot of the populations on both sides, they for the longest time believed that the only one that could stop this was the US. And we very clearly see now that that doesn't work. So who would be that strong power broker that would just put down his or her foot? We're not really seeing that now. So there's a huge shift. And in the weeks to come, we'll also see on sort of the response, Israel-Iran, you know, the threat. You were saying, Svetlana, also about the threat of using nukes, and there we are again. And it's just a very uncomfortable time. But I have to say also, it's tearing also the individual societies apart. I mean, Israel is not a homogeneous country. It's really tearing that society apart. Some of those organizations that Miriam mentioned, I've also worked with, and you're just seeing the same kind of polarization that we're seeing elsewhere in the world. We're also seeing in those very same societies who feel that they're not represented by their political leaders. So it's, you know, from intra-Israeli conflict to Iran, it's, I think in the coming months, at least until the US elections, we'll see.
There were a couple of more questions from the audience. I'm gonna, yes, you and you. Let's see if we can get to you.
My name is Lisbeth Pilgaard, and I'm here as member of the Nordic Women Mediators from the Danish chapter. Thank you for all your great input. I think a reflection for being part of this network and wanting to spread the word of dialogue and peace. We are living in hard times, and I increasingly meet nearly hostility when I try to push for the agenda of peace and dialogue. I'm also being accused of being ridiculous, of being naive. I mean, it's quite, it's an interesting development that suddenly something that I previously thought was common, acknowledged, I now represent a minority. I mean, I'm putting up a bit black and white, but I mean, my own country, militarization is the agenda. That's just how money is going to be spent, and there is broadly across the political spectrum of the parties in Denmark an agreement that that's how we are going to run the world. So my question is, as the title of this session, how do we keep the dialogue going, and how do we as representatives of this dialogue, of trying to want to pursue peaceful dialogue, how do we go about it? Because I think we also need to revise our wording and our way, because the perception of it has changed, and the power fragmentation is happening, which I think is very interesting and a good thing. And just a comment to you, Nita, saying you blame COVID. On the other hand, I think COVID actually also opened more people's eyes to that the world is interconnected. So I think there were pros and cons of that those years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to get a question from you as well, and we will have to see how.
Thank you very much. I'm also from Nordic Women Mediators from the Norwegian branch, and I work in a multilateral organization, and I think a number of you also mentioned I work in the OSCE in Vienna. So I think there was a number of debates also earlier today about this kind of, the role of multilateralism and the kind of erosion of it. And I was also wondering, I mean, what I see is like we've seen a change from this kind of, a lot of the tools that were built, you know, for both negotiations and for dialogue and other kind of tools for peace were created, at least in our case, maybe at the time there was a bit more of a cooperative spirit. And I see now it's very hard. I mean, we are really facing a big challenge in, you know, just for them even to talk and even for the states to have a role, you know, in also solving all these really difficult problems that we are facing. So I was also wondering, like, I mean, we are still kind of very much engaging by the kind of same way of diplomacy that we have done in those times, and I'm just wondering, like how do we kind of now also talk when we see more kind of adversary kind of time, and I think this might last for a long time, and I'm just wondering what kind of rule of engagement can we think about in the future also to still be able to have some level of dialogue.
Thank you. So,
on Lisbeth's question, yeah, do you know what? I think we need to also to be smarter and not just be comfortable in our own little dialogue PC zone. And one of the things is also innovation, use of technology, AI, also on how we measure impact. We're really bad at that. And it's hard because, you know, you enter an unknown field and you're not building a water well. You're trying to settle a conflict between people who have very different beliefs also. So it's very difficult. But I do think that a lot is on us. So even if I sounded negative in my donor bashing in the beginning, I think that we have a lot to learn as well. So no easy answer, but for sure it's a lot on us.
Absolutely. I think we need to be smarter. And everyone who has sat down with parties that are in hot conflict know that you really need to measure your words, and you need to come with initiatives that they find useful in the situation that they are in. Svetlana talked about prioritization earlier today, you know. And what's the first priority? The first priority is to survive. If you're in a deadly battle, winning that battle, surviving that battle is your first priority. So I think we need to be smarter in terms of how we bring in specific agendas in those situations, because if we're not smart in doing that, we will be rejected and everyone will lose. So that would be my remark related to that, because it is difficult to get people to open up and use of their valuable capacity to prepare for peace and prepare for dialogue and negotiations, as we spoke about earlier today. So I absolutely agree. We need to be smarter.
do you want to comment?
Just to respond very quickly to Lisbeth on COVID, absolutely agree on the interconnectedness. But it also, I think COVID did do something else. It highlighted some of the inequities in the world, in how different countries were treated vis-a-vis the vaccine. So it comes back to the issue of the selectivity, the inequities, etc. So while in one sense we were in our bubble talking amongst ourselves, there was also the exposure to the inequities and the selectivity on the broader global scale. Regarding multilateral institutions and the erosion of their capacity to do peacemaking, etc., I think multilateral institutions are, by their very nature, state-centric. It's very difficult to move from that structural approach to doing peacemaking to putting psychology and understanding human behavior at a human level, at an individual level, at the same, in a balance. But I think multilateral institutions could make more of an effort to see how they can develop checks and balances. Today, the whole debate is about Security Council's veto. etc. I know that Liechtenstein has promoted the idea that a veto should be explained in the General Assembly. But I think we could perhaps consider one step more, that perhaps a veto that goes against the will of the entire globe could be challenged by the General Assembly, like in a democratic context where a constitutional reform would require 2/3 majority in the state and parliament, etc. One could see whether the General Assembly could challenge a veto that way. That might bring some check balance to the exercise of a veto. I mean, creative ways in which multilateral institutions can regain their primacy a little bit in the way peace and security issues are handled.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, just briefly. So I'd like to say that I was raised as a positivist academically, but eventually I moved to narrative analysis or discourse analysis, which I find more and more useful precisely for addressing conflicts, to be able to look at the narratives that move people to action, that make people have so much hate and so on, and to be able to precisely break these narratives, like being pro-Palestine is being anti-Semitic, things like that. The dichotomies that have governed the world, the West versus the rest. The Cold War period, socialism as against democracy, aka capitalism. These kinds of dichotomies that have defined our understanding of the world have created much of the problem, and we need to get a good handle on how we are framing things, how actors are framing their own motivations to build peace, basically, and also to basically justify their wars, unless we are able to get at the root of this. I mean, we haven't discussed about violent extremism, which was on top of the world's agenda some 3 years, perhaps 4 years ago, but it's still there. And it's a question of contestation about what kind of world we want to imagine, one that has not been defined by these dichotomies, nor any of these hateful narratives that have divided our communities.
Thank you. We have officially run out of time, but I want to give each and every one of you just a couple of seconds for some final thoughts. Should we start that?
Oh, that's a hard one. I have hope. I really, really do. And one of the reasons is also seeing all of you here, seeing that at least my organization, we are totally overworked. We're always asked to do things in all over the world, and we're kept very, very busy. And that means something. That means that there's still a need for mediation, negotiation, support, and dialogue, and that does give me hope. And I think patience and stubbornness are also very good attributes.
Yes. Yeah, we need to continue hoping, imagining, I guess, and the work that you're all doing is, extremely important, even if it's difficult. We can't lose hope. We just need to keep on, and we need to do better and be smarter.
Maybe I'll just end with a quote from a young woman also who we met when we did our field work. She said, "Peace can be sustained if we are able to check our own assumptions and prejudices, and if we don't give up on the art of dialogue." Thank you.
I would kind of position myself as a realistic idealist. So I want to continue to work with the world as it is, but know where I want to go to and what the world that I would like to see evolve, taking very incremental, realistic steps towards that goal.
You sound like a possibilist to me, to use William Ury's word.
Whatever the label.
Thank you all so much. This has been extremely interesting. Like I said, I could have spoken to each and every one of you for the entire day. I sort of asked you in the beginning to sort of, help me becoming optimistic again. I don't think you managed that. But I realized that maybe I'm not a cynical journalist. Perhaps I'm just a realistic journalist. There's a bleak outlook.